So as Christoph already introduced, my name is Marc Burgauer. I'm earning my living mostly still as an Agile coach, but I started a company with some pals a while back where we're trying to apply social practice theory to how we're reorganizing organizations. And I'm not going to talk much about that. I'm going to mostly talk about actually how you have to reorganize your organization if you want to get the value and be successful with APIs. So I'm coming from a complexity background. As I said, I studied biology, got an interest in complexity that never left me. I kept on it, tried to apply this to how we did a startup. Started in 1999 doing internet applications. The reason I became an Agile coach is more this is sort of the little coat I can put on that allows me to get into organizations, start talking about the things that we really need to talk about. I mean, Agile is great, but it's not the full story, but it is sort of the role that people allow you to start actually look at how you can improve how you do the work, how ways of working can be improved. I look at organization as a socio-technical system. Trond will talk about this, I believe, a bit more at, I think it's 4:30 this afternoon. So you should go and catch that talk. But I want to talk about APIs as membranes. Why did I choose that metaphor? An API sort of puts itself in between your organization and the people who are using some of your IT capabilities through your APIs. And really, it's important that we're focusing here on the people. So there are people using your API, and there are people who are providing the infrastructure that enables the API, and the people then who create the API are almost sitting in between. So these are all people interactions, and when we talk about people interactions, we have to understand complexity. So when we talk about good APIs, we can't just talk about technology, which I believe most of this conference is about. So I'm not going to talk actually much or at all about API as a technology, but we need to think about how we co-evolve our the people that are working on the APIs and creating and supporting the APIs, as well as the people who are using the APIs at the same time as we develop the technology for the APIs. So what do I mean with a membrane, or why do I choose this metaphor? So membranes are the first, emergence of membranes in biology were biofilms. And what you're seeing here is a Volvox sphere. It's a very simple multicellular organism, but you can see it creates an inside and an outside. So an early evolution that allowed cells to specialize. So the outside cells, the ones that are looking outside, they deal with movement, commotion, and filtration. And the insides start to specialize on reproduction. So what you see is little baby Volvox spheres, so to speak, inside. They're protected through the membrane of the Volvox sphere from the outside, so from the volatility of the influences, etc. This all gets mediated by the membrane until the babies are ready to deal with the environment, until they're grown up, so to speak, and then the Volvox sphere releases its babies. So a membrane creates an inside and an outside. Or another way to talk about this is it mediates the interactions between the participants inside and outside of the membrane. I want to do just a quick detour so you understand a little bit of how I'm thinking about systems, or what I mean with that about system. And I'm going to use the articulation from Russ Acuff. So if you Google on YouTube, or you go on YouTube and look for if Russ Acuff had given a TED Talk, you will find him explaining this in a little bit more depth. But there are 5 points that we need to acknowledge when we talk about systems. So a whole consists of parts, each of which can affect its behaviors or properties. So you are biological systems. You consist of lungs, and you have a heart, you have a stomach, and so on, each of which can affect your behavior or your properties. In order to be effective, each part depends on other parts, so the parts are interdependent. So no part of the system can have independently an effect on the system. The heart requires oxygen from the lungs. The brain depends on what the heart and lungs are doing, etc. The parts are all interconnected. A system is a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts. So if I start just carving things out of you, you're no longer alive. That has very important implications that are often overlooked. The essential or defining properties of a system are properties that none of its parts have. So let's take a simple system, or as Christoph's categorization would say, a complicated system. Let's take a car, yeah? A car can transport you from one location to another. None of its parts can do that, yeah? The seat can't, the axle can't, the motor can't carry itself from one place to another. So you have certain characteristics, the most important of which is that you are alive. None of your parts are alive on their own. That's just you. You have life. You can write, but your hands can't write, and that's easy to demonstrate. Just cut off your hand, put it on a table, and see what happens. You eyes don't see, it's you that sees. Your brain isn't thinking, it's you that's thinking. So when a system is taken apart, it loses its essential properties. If I take apart a car, I no longer have an automobile. I just have junk lying around. So to sum up, a system is not the sum of its parts, it's a product of its interactions. And when we talk about these interactions, the important thing to understand is that the relationship, the quality of the relationship of the parts matters more than the quality of the parts themselves. Now, we'll get back to this, but just imagine you would take an engine from a Mercedes, you take the chassis from a Lamborghini, or you take the transmission from a Toyota, and the interior of a Bentley. It's all great stuff, but you won't even have a car because the parts don't fit. So in a system, especially in a complex adaptive system, as Christoph talked about, the parts co-evolve, yeah? So there's no use just optimizing one part, or local optima, as we talk in theory of constraints. You have to think about the whole thing and evolve the parts together to improve the whole. So back to APIs. How does that help with creating better APIs? So I want to show you a few little methods or ideas that I have and that we're applying to create APIs. And so the first one is going back to the metaphor or the title of my talk. So what do I mean with skin? So here we're going to look a little bit about the service design approach, and the visualization I'm using I learned from Alberto Soranzo, who's a great service designer. So if you want to know more about service design, look for Alberto Soranzo. So you can look at an organization as this funnel, and in it there are these components, yeah? So components can be looked at as infrastructure, departments, teams, or you can go finer grained, operations, delivery, sales, or even then finer certain capabilities that teams or so provide for the organization. So if we translate the outcome from ACOF, then the quality of an organization is really the quality of the relationship between these components more than the quality of the components. So it's fantastic if you have a great sales team, but if your operations and your delivery team can't support it, then your organization will not be seen as great by its customers. So traditionally, the first skin that organizations had was analog, yeah? So you would have shops, and there you would have shopkeepers, and they need to get to know their customers. You might have telephony. So without the human element in telephony, what we now see with the robotics is that we suddenly get failure demand. Failure demand is a concept from Lean, and it basically says, so you're setting up your users to fail, so they call into your call center, they have to go through a bunch of menus. And now with robotics, that can be a circular thing, and you never actually get to talk to a human person. And what you're creating with these systems is failure for your customers. So again, you need to understand how your customers interact. Like a shopkeeper, you have to get to know your customers to set up successful telephony systems, or you might have sales reps that actually go to your customers. And a big clue of being a good salesperson is actually understand the customer's problem. So these are all human interactions. And so to have a good skin means you have to have human skills what we call soft skills, even though that might be a slightly questionable categorization. So the second skin that organizations then got was the digital skill. You will just know this as websites and apps for phones, etc. And so the common thing between both of these is that nowadays we use service design approaches to learn how we best design these. So we do user research. And if you've been ever exposed to user research, you know this is interactive. There's conversations going on. The research is done with the customer rather than to the customer. And designs are refined through a series of such interactions with customers. So then we get to the third skin, and we don't have yet that much of an articulations from service design and how we should actually deal with APIs. But the way I want you to think about it is you are providing an experience for developers. So maybe we should call this developer experience rather than user experiences. Think about what kind of people are actually using our designs, our APIs. These are developers. So I want to stress that you can't do the analytics just, you can't do your research just by doing the analytics. So let's do an example that might be illuminating a little bit of how I think about this. In design, we talk about co-design, and it's the experience that is co-created by the customer's choices. So take the Starbucks. You go into a Starbucks, and Starbucks sort of is like a platform to create a coffee experience, but you have to sort of make your choices. If you ever, the first time you've gone into a Starbucks and you didn't know this, you say, I want a coffee. They will have started, what kind of coffee? Well, do you want this? Do you want that? Etc. But the 20th time you go into Starbucks, you probably know now what coffee you want. You go in and I said, I want my latte macchiato or whatever you fancy. So you perform the co-design. You co-create with the platform, Starbucks, your coffee experience. So the important thing is that Starbucks actually defers the final configuration of your experience. And when you do APIs, you should think about that as well. How can you defer some of the decisions to the customer, to the user, the consumer of your APIs? There's also something to think about variety and variation. So the difference between variety and variation. Variety is all the options that you have available to compose your coffee experience. So a good product allows you to have more variation or create more variation, and not all of these have to be tested. Variety is what you want. More variety allows you to create more experience. The variation is you want to reduce the variation of the experience of a specific configuration. So next day you have a coffee, you want to have the same kind of coffee and it wants to taste the same. So that's the variation that you want to eliminate. If you've never done user experience stuff and you want to get a start, so try to have conversations with developers who use your API. You might find them in-house if you're in a large organization. It might be a bit more difficult if you're a startup. And then maybe have some people sit in and listen to this conversation and fill in empathy maps. I would recommend that you go to the one from Dave Gray. There's others around, but he created this, and I still think his empathy maps are the best ones. And the empathy map will start to promote thinking about people as wholes. How do they feel? What are their goals? What they're trying to achieve? What are they saying? What are the needs or the pains? So empathy maps as a tool to do research. So to sum up the service design approach for the outside, the quality of the interactions that an API enables for its consumers matters more than the quality of the parts of the API themselves. So if you create an API and all your technical parts are excellent, but the consumers of your API do not know about it and have difficulties actually accessing this and consuming your API, all this excellence is for naught. Yeah. So focus on how your developers are using your API and then develop your technology alongside. Co-evolve. Now let's talk a little about the inside. That's especially important if you're in large organizations. How do you fit in? How do API teams fit into the organizations? So what you most likely will experience is a pull in two directions. Yeah, so you will have your product teams or your E2E teams, and they want to adapt to market conditions. They want to have differentiation, or the ability to differentiate. And then you have your central IT probably, and they want to optimize all the time. Yeah. So the outward looking is about increasing your adaptability. You can think about requisite variety that Christoph talked about, but inward looking, it's all about cost, isn't it? It's about cost cutting and efficiencies, etc. Standard word for that, bimodal IT. So even if your organization doesn't subscribe bimodal IT, I bet if it's a large one, you will have experienced a tension between these two poles. And the issue is that it's actually a false dichotomy. Andrew Clay Schaefer already started to articulate this. He's called it the wall of confusion, so between development operations. And DevOps is a very good way to get around this. And if you do DevOps really how it's intended, then you probably don't have the problems that I'm going to talk about, because you already have these conversations going on. But often DevOps is seen as a purely technical solution. And how it pans out is that every time you have a problem between developers of, let's say, OPIs and operations, every time you have to renegotiate between this bimodal dichotomy. So something's still missing. So this is where an idea comes in from a guy called James Bloom. If you Google 3 economies and Jay Bloom, you will find lots of interesting content, but essentially Jay took a socio-technical approach to design, and he says, actually, we need to have the right economic logic for management. So I'm quickly going to frame the problem using his articulation. So the first economy is differentiation. So this is what your product teams do. This is what you do at the front end of my funnel when you interact with customers. This is what service design talks about. So you want to have fast cycle times of change, most likely using an agile approach. You want to have the capability to hit at the right moment. You can't predict when opportunities in the market emerge, so you have to have the ability to, when they pop up, that you're fast enough to actually take advantage of it. The value really comes from creating variety of effective products, using the same consumables at the back end. I'm going to talk about what we mean by those consumables in a moment. You want to have a unique competitive position so that your sales are really working, that it's sales driven. Yeah, so it's very outward looking at the customer, etc. The second economy, Jay calls an economy of scale. And here are what we're looking after, the consumables. So economic of scale looks like of the network, CPU, storage, databases, maybe in your firewall. Although it's questionable whether your security should sit there. You might want to discuss this once you understand the 3 economies. Slow cycle times, or slower at least, and we're using a lean approach because we're very cost driven. So we want to squeeze out all the waste. Slower as in you can't have a new database product every 2 months just because something new appeared that you would quite like to use for development. The capability is basically seen as operational excellence. It's your ability to reliably reproduce these consumables. Yeah, so people say, hey, I need CPUs, they get CPUs. But the value comes from efficiencies of operation, which also means they have to actually control these consumables. If you overconsume CPU or your network, all other teams are suffering for it. So they put controls on you so that you can't overconsume. So in the middle between these two sits what Jabe calls an economy of scope. Yeah, and I believe this is where API should sit. So the idea of having an economy in the middle is to start to mediate between the two extremes. Differentiation and scale, they're really not getting along with one another. So here it's about accelerating differentiation and helping making the consumables more reusable. So what fits into this? So Jabe talks about reusable data, well-formed functions, pattern of configurations of consumables. So stuff that you also can stick into your platform. An example is TomTom that now has a traffic API. Yeah, so you no longer need to use TomTom's applications. You can use their API. They make some of their functionality available to you through the API, but they're also using the data, and the value of the API will become bigger the more people are actually using it. So a key factor for a scope economy is that the resources it provides gain in use, gain in value the more they are used. So that's different from what scale economy looks after, where if it's overused, you actually have a problem. So the capability comes from harvesting stuff most likely from your scale economy, but maybe also from your differentiation economy, and start making them more widely available. So this needs its own management and has to follow its own logic. So it shouldn't be owned either by a scale or differentiation economy. And it's not just about technology. If you need help with reorganizing your IT or to make this possible, this is the sort of stuff Contextualize can help you about. I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm going to skip, but look up Postel's law because it plays into a little bit how you need to behave towards the inside and the outside. So just summing up quickly, the takeaways: so apply user research principles, not just with your consumer, but maybe ideally also with your stakeholder. Evolve your organization of your API teams around scope economy, not scale or differentiation. Enable more variety in your interactions that your consumers of your API can have, and try to reduce the variation in the dependency on your organization. So I hope this was useful, and thank you for giving me your time. I put here the link again to this mailing list that Christoph started, or that Pronovic started. I will participate on that. So if you have any questions, you can ask there. You can find me on Twitter on Somesheep, and maybe we still have a few minutes to answer questions now. I'm hoping.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for introducing me to the three economies concept, because I think that's exactly that helps to explain, like, what's wrong with just thinking about this as an efficiency story, or what's wrong of thinking it's as simply a variety story, like an adaptiveness story. It's like it has to be both at the same time. How successful are organizations at doing this? Because like you are in the trenches from day to day. Probably it's not that easy, but
So the concept of three economies is relatively new. So Jay put this out early last year. So I don't think there are many organizations yet that explicitly embraced three economies, but there are some. So if you Google Jay, look for podcasts, there are actually already a couple of companies that have invited him to do podcasts, and you can actually hear that they embrace it. But you can look at some of the FANG, so Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. The way they're approaching platforms, they're already doing this in some shape or form. So they're already looking for, which are the things that we're producing that become more valuable in use? And AWS itself is a good example of that. It has become more valuable to Amazon, but also to us as developers or technology people, because more people are using it.
It's and that's the crucial part, right? That it's like that confusion of, well, this needs to be scarce. No, this needs to be something you tried as much people as possible to use. Like, and how do you navigate that? And like, in having a clear understanding of like, okay, no, this is scale, this is scope, this is differentiation. That helps with that. So this is very useful.
That's why Jay stresses that you have to also make this happen at the management layer. So your API, your platform, they have to have different management logic, and hence you can't expect the same people to manage this layer of your organization than either of the other two. Because there's only so many masters or principles or value articulations you can really keep in your head and follow. So at the scale end, you have to think about costs. At the customer end, you have to think about differentiation. Neither of it is quite right for APIs or platforms.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you for joining and for giving this talk and for jumping into the venture. Was a really interesting talk, and I'm curious to see how it will resonate. Yeah, thanks a lot.